All right, so it is, here we go. We are now live. Hi, everyone. Thank you for tuning in on this, well, in Edinburgh, it's certainly very dark night for the 2022 winner announcement and shortlist night for the Bread and Roses Award. I'm going to be your host, and then, like the voice of God, my co-host, Ross from Five Leaves, is going to give a little bit of context for the award and for the Alliance of Radical Booksellers. And then we'll have a chance to hear from our shortlistees who are going to tell us about their amazing books. And then we will have our big announcement. If you have questions that crop up throughout, feel free to stick them in the chat and we'll have a chance to put them to our writers later. And now I'm just going to ask Ross, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
Thanks very much, Mary. I'm sorry, people, to be speaking from a blank screen. Those who know me may think that's advantageous, but my camera is not working tonight, so I have a disembodied voice. The Bread and Roses Award for Radical Publishing has been running for around 10 years. It's sponsored by the Alliance of Radical Booksellers, which is an organisation of new and secondhand booksellers around the country. It's a light touch organisation. We have a website. You can look to see who our members are. And our membership has gone up quite a bit in the last year. There are 10 new members. As well as the Bread and Roses Award, in the same way as that adults sometimes produce children, the Bread and Roses Award produced the Little Rebels Award for Radical Children's Writing, which is also organised through the Alliance of Radical Booksellers, primarily by the Letterbox Library, one of our very long-standing organisations that specialises and always has specialised in diverse children's books. So we have the Bread and Roses Award, we have the Little Rebels Award. We also, paused because of COVID, have the London Radical Book Fair, which has been organised in the past by the Alliance of Radical Booksellers. This year, last weekend, in fact, we had a modest replacement organised by On the Record, an event called Quiet Revolutions, which was looking at the past and future and history of radical bookselling in Britain. And if you root around in the internet in a few days' time, you'll be able to see the videos of all of the contributions there. Amongst the contributions was Nick Goretzky, who's coordinator of the Alliance of Radical Booksellers. He works at Houseman's Bookshop. There are a number of other projects floating around. We have a Radical Bookshops history newsletter. We have Feminist Book Fortnight. The Radical History newsletter is now up to 5 editions. And the Feminist Book Fortnight, which is coordinated by Jane at Five Leaves. We've had something like 60 bookshops taking part, including bookshops in Italy and Ireland. And my colleague Jane is still furious with me that she wasn't allowed a study tour of Ireland and Italy to follow up what they were doing. You can follow the Alliance on Facebook. The very first Bread and Roses Award was run by the unfortunately now late David Graeber. The book that he won with was called Debt. Last year, the winner was Ellen Clifford with her book, The War on Disabled People. The shortlists, if you go onto the Bread and Roses website and you look at the shortlists over the 10 years of it, you can see just the strength of radical publishing in Britain, both from small presses, independent presses, and indeed major presses, or books written by people who are resident in this country. I'm going to step out now back to Mary, and at least from now on, you'll be able to see people rather than simply have a disembodied voice. Have a good evening.
Thank you so much, Ross. I've done that thing on Zoom where you don't unmute yourself. It was such a thrill to be invited by Ross and by Nick from Houseman's to sort of shepherd a new chapter, another chapter, just so that this prize could keep going after Nick took a step back last year. It's a huge privilege. It's one of those lists that as a reader, I've looked out for years, and as a bookseller, it's doing something truly unique in elevating and making more reachable to a lot of readers, books that often get missed in mainstream reviews. And what was remarkable yet again was this year we had over 70 submissions, so our judges had a lot of reading to do, and they included Abs, Anita, Jane, and Noor, who around very busy lives over a year chipped away at those. And we ended up with a long list this year, a long list of 10, which also included Cut from the Same Cloth, Make Bosses Pay by Eve Livingston, Planet on Fire, which was Matthew Lawrence and Laurie Leyburn, The Transgender Issue by Sean Fay, and The 32, an anthology of working class voices. And that was the long list. So getting that down to 5 was incredibly difficult. But here we were with 5 final incredible books that we felt represented the richness of radical publishing, the richness of topics that people were invested in sharing the stories of. And so to introduce each of those books that we were so thrilled ended up on our shortlist, I'm going to ask each of the author or editor or contributor to tell you more about it directly. And because we have to set something up arbitrarily, first up is going to be Koshka for Abolishing the Police. I think we also have Chris, so I'm going to ask you to, enable camera. Hello. And so I'm going to disappear for a wee moment while you tell us a little bit more about Abolishing the Police.
Oh, thank you so much. And yeah, it's really, really wonderful to be here. Some of the books that have been shortlisted, that have been longlisted, they're written by my absolute heroes, so it's incredible to be in this company. I thought to introduce the book, which I'm the editor of. I'd read just a bit from the introduction. And so this is how the very beginning of the book, we dive right in. Begins with a quote. "The police are not the only agents of oppression or the only perpetrators of violence. The purpose of the police, though, is neither to fight oppression nor to reduce violence, but to uphold public order, which means the order of capital and private property, of white supremacy, of patriarchy. The category of criminal exists for those who disrupt that order, and that category is expanding." That's a quote from Cops Off Campus. December 2013. Thousands of students marched through the university campuses of central London, determined to make the area, if only for a brief symbolic moment, a cop-free zone. They protect themselves from police truncheons with shields painted to look like the covers of books. As images of riot police raining down blows on George Orwell's 1984 begin to circulate on social media, the BBC is more interested in reporting a burning bin, hashtag Cops Off Campus is picked up by groups around the country. It will not be the last time. I begin with Cops Off Campus because, in a sense, that is where this book begins. It was there that I first met Craig Clark, who went on to found Dog Section Press, although we only really got to know each other a few months later at Highbury Magistrates Court, where, along with several of my friends, he was prosecuted for his part in the protests. The demonstration had been called in response to the university management's increasingly regular use of the police to stifle dissent on campus, and in particular, to suppress a vibrant and growing campaign by cleaners and other outsourced workers for sick pay, holidays, and pensions. The conditions these workers, predominantly migrant women, faced within the profit-driven university included routinely unpaid wages, as well as bullying and sexual harassment. In the months leading up to the Cops Off Campus mobilisation, cleaners' picket lines had been hassled by police. The president of the Students' Union had been arrested for organising a protest without consulting the police. A student, me in fact, had been arrested and charged with criminal damage for publicising a rally in chalk on the wall of a university building. And just the night before, riot police had been called to evict an occupation in support of the cleaners' demands, with officers filmed punching students in the face. Still fresh in our minds was a time a few years earlier when cleaners fighting for the living wage at the nearby School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, had been called into an apparently routine meeting with management, only to be met by immigration enforcement officers hiding behind the curtains. Several trade union organisers had been deported by the end of the day. Many remembered too the police truncheons and kettles, horse charges, mass arrests and prosecutions for public order offences, some carrying lengthy prison terms, that had been used to push through the tripling of tuition fees and the scrapping of the educational maintenance allowance, a small grant to enable young people from low-income backgrounds to remain in education, in the face of popular resistance in 2010. December 2010, a high metallic wire, content exceeds phrase. What we were learning was that any attempt at emancipatory social change, or simply to resist the imposition of even more miserable and insecure conditions on the already miserable and insecure, and the plunging of more people into those conditions, was going to come up against the police. Meanwhile, the inquest into the police shooting of Mark Duggan in Tottenham, which had provoked uprisings across the country in August 2011, was coming to an end. Its official upshot: lawful killing. The court ruled that a police officer shooting an unarmed black person dead in the street does not count as breaking the law. By contrast, participants in the uprising had been fast-tracked through 24-hour courts and handed draconian sentences, often without trial or access to independent legal advice. One teenage girl, for instance, was given 8 months in prison for shoplifting items, including a bottle of Lucozade and some sweets. The day the verdict was announced, another Cops Off Campus protest, larger than the first, marched to the High Court to chants of "Police are murderers" and "Who killed Mark Duggan? You killed Mark Duggan." Early 2012. The latest news is political flashes superimposed on our rooftops. As the authors of a more recent Cops Off Campus project write, the best arguments against policing come from paying careful, sustained and rigorous attention to several points: what police actually do, the conditions that make them possible, and who benefits most directly from policing and whose lives are negatively impacted by it. So, while this collection may begin with a bunch of students in central London, that is not where it stays. Looking at what the police actually do and whose lives are negatively impacted means looking beyond the more spectacular, visible moments of policing we find at demonstrations. It means paying attention to the experiences of everyday policing that, as Vanessa Thompson notes in her contribution to this volume, often go unnoticed and unseen by large parts of society. One task of this book is to make more people see the oppressive violence that goes into upholding what passes for order, despite the disorder and trauma it spells for many, and see how things might be otherwise. Imagine a world without that violence. So I'll stop there. The final thing I wanted to say about the book is just that it's an illustrated collection. So it's got illustrations from the wonderful artist Kat Sims running through it, illustrating all of the pieces. It also comes along with a glossary, an online glossary in which all of the theoretical or potentially unfamiliar terms that we use in the book are explained. And that's a really important part of making this collection accessible. So as well as thanking Kat and all the contributors, I would also like to thank the resistance movements that have brought this book from a niche project to at the center of our political discussions. That's people putting their their minds and their bodies on the line, on the streets, in cells, people on the sharp end of policing. So I want to thank all of them for this opportunity to be here today.
Thank you so much, Koshka, and thank you I'm so glad you showed the insides of the book. One of the aspects of the award that I love as a bookseller and also as a reader is that accessibility, this idea that books that have big ideas and big political ideas should be accessible to anyone and everyone. And that's how we build movements, is getting these ideas out there. And sometimes we can get so caught up internally that we forget that the discourse can be impenetrable to some people, or that some language or some ideas just are completely unfamiliar. And so it was really powerful seeing that book in the world. Yeah. Thank you for putting it together. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And so I'm going to we're going to loop back with some questions for everyone, but next I'm going to ask for Florian Grosset to put, there you go, your camera on, and to tell us a little bit about the Chagos betrayal.
Hello, good evening, everyone, and thank you for having me. It's such incredible to be among the shortlisted, and I get up against those amazing books. The Chagos betrayal is a book about a population who were forcibly removed from their islands by the UK government, because the UK government wanted to lease the main island of the archipelago in the Indian Ocean to the US government, so that the latter can build a military base, the largest one, outside of the US. And so between 1965 and 1973, the UK government wiped out all the islands of the Chagos, denied that there were an existing population there, lied about them, saying they were contractors. Some of them were only 2 years old, and dumped them on Mauritius and the Seychelles with nothing, no compensation, no assistance, no help. So this is the story of these people, how they were dumped, what they went through, how they survived on nothing after they were thrown into a life of poverty, and how they protest throughout decades, how they took the UK government to court. They won some cases, they lost most of them, because what can a small population of Black people, of descendants of enslaved population, how can they win against superpower like the UK, like the US? And in my book, it's mostly illustrations, because this is how I tell stories. I've tried to tell their story, to show what they went through, and to convey these feelings. And they went, you name it, they went through it. They had no money, they had no food, they lived in slums. They went through drugs, prostitutions, all sorts to be able to survive. And nowadays, some of them live in the UK, some of them in Seychelles, and some of them in Mauritius, but they are still fighting for their right to return to their islands, for their right to be recognized as a population, not as Mauritians, not as British, but as Chagosians who once lived there. And the fight is still on, even if the UK government nowadays has recognized somehow that they are illegally occupying the Chagos. This was ruled by the International Court of Justice back in 2020. But it's still a long process to allow the Chagosians to go back home. For instance, if you're a rich person, you can go to the Chagos because you are sailing around, you can stop and you can go there and enjoy the beaches and the sea. If you're Chagosian, you were born there, or you're a descendant of the Chagosian, you need permission, special permission to go to your island. You need to be accompanied by the army and just to spend a day there. And this is not normal at all. Plus, the book raised they raised the concern about the way they were treated when they were deported. They were treated as slaves, if I can mention this word. They were not treated as human beings, not with no respect at all. And I have tried to show all these through illustrations, and they are an amazing population, just a bunch of them, but with the courage of the lion, if you know what I mean. So I'm very, very happy and honored to be among the shortlisted tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. It is a truly extraordinary book. And one of the things that all the judges mentioned was just how unfamiliar this piece of our history was. And I think, especially in the last few years, as a sort of concerted effort has been made to decolonize the curriculum, to open up conversations about legacies of colonialism, to hold our government to account for a lot of what they've done in the past. It was shocking to a few of our judges. It was shocking to me that this was a chapter that had so little airtime and was so current.
Yes, and it happened only in the 70s, so it's not that old.
Yeah,
is what is shocking.
And it's so heartbreaking then seeing in the end that that to see lives that are being cut short, and lives that ultimately, people who will never go back to their homeland. But we have an opportunity to make that different for generations future. So thank you for putting this beautiful and powerful book out into the world. So next up, also fittingly, to talk about Britain's legacies of empire, about institutional racism, about so much more. We are going to hear from Sita Balani about Empire's Endgame.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you everyone who's tuned in tonight. I'm Sita Balani. I'm repping the whole Empire's Endgame family. There's 8 of us, so it's myself, Gargi Bhattacharya, Adam Elliott Cooper, Kojo Koram, Dalia Gabriel, Luke De Nerona, Nadine El-Nani, Karem. I think that's everyone. And so I'm not going to read, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about how Empire's Endgame came together. So writing the book was an absolute pleasure. It was so much fun, which I think anyone who's ever written a book solo would say that's a thing you don't often get to say. But writing a book with your friends is just brilliant. So the impetus behind it was really the project of cultural studies, particularly cultural studies that came out of the Centre for the Cultural Studies in Birmingham at the end of the 1970s, and 2 books, Empire Strikes Back and Policing the Crisis, which had this huge influence on all of us. And that project of cultural studies, one that's politically engaged, collaborative, uninterested in academic disciplines or in political dogma, that was the kind of project that we still felt really connected to. And we felt that it was one of the kind of key ways in which we'd seen people try in writing to understand the here and now. So that was our kind of impetus, was that project, wanting to say, okay, that was a really important bit of work for us, thinking about how Britain got here, thinking about how Britain was in the 70s and the early 80s, but we wanted to understand the Britain we lived in today. We were seeing rising racism, we were seeing rising nationalism, authoritarianism, and we wanted to know what was going on. At first, we just cooked each other's dinner and went to the pub and said, oh yeah, we're going to write a book, it's going to be sick. And then we didn't actually manage to really write any words for a good long while. But eventually we realized that if we did want to actually write something down, we would have to stop meeting at the pub and start meeting in the daytime and start meeting with our laptops. So that's what we started to do. And we would meet up in someone's office usually, because many of us work in university. So we'd squat in someone's office and we would spend an hour or so just talking through something that one of us had noticed, something annoying we'd seen on Twitter, some strange thing that happened in the news, something we'd seen on our way to work. And from there, one of us would map that on a whiteboard, and we would see where that took us And then we would spend 45 minutes writing in silence together. We called it our exam conditions. So someone would set a timer and we would write in exam conditions before putting those pieces together, and then over the next few months editing them together. And our aim was, in that process, to dissolve our individual voices into a collective one. So our hope was that in that process, what we would do is we would find a way to kind of merge together a little bit. And that then when the book came out, finally, we'd be able to open it up, read a paragraph, and we wouldn't know who had written it. I think now when I open the book, that is exactly how I feel. I never remember who wrote anything. I don't remember the parts that I wrote, because all of that kind of came out of collective conversations and collective editing. And so we're really trying to understand, you know, where was Britain at this moment? What was going on? Our initial question was, excuse my language, but we all wrote at the top of our screens, like, what the fuck is going on? And that really was the question we were trying to answer. So we tried to think about the overlapping folk devils that haunt the collective landscape, gangs, illegal immigrants, and child abusers. These were kind of stories in the tabloid press running riot on social media. We wanted to understand, what do these figures, what do these myths do to kind of forward a nationalist project? We talked about the phrase "send in the army." We'd noticed that anytime anything happened, someone on the right in this country would call for the army to be sent in to do that heavy lifting. And we wanted to understand this through a sense of how was this desire for authoritarianism being cultivated. And we ended up spending a fair bit of time thinking about the figure of the buffoon. This was when Boris Johnson was on his ascendancy. And so we talked a lot about the work that buffoonery was doing to kind of enable this shift to the right. An earlier moment, we were really struggling to come up with a title, and the best title we could come up with, which I still think would have been great, was going to be State Racism and Buffoonery, but that one was sadly vetoed. So that's kind of a flavour of how we got there, how we ended up writing the book. And one of the things that I was really heartened to see on the shortlist, sorry, that's my timer. One of the things I was really heartened to see on the shortlist was how many collaborative projects there were. Like, collaboration is clearly the order of the day. It's a delight to be on a shortlist with so many other people attempting to confront our shared dilemma, our shared conundrum together. And I think that thinking together was the most exciting thing about the project, and is a really exciting thing about the whole shortlist. So thanks very much. It's really great to be here.
Thank you so much for that. It's such an important point you make about collaboration, and about books that have sort of come into being from a melting pot of ideas, and you can really feel it in the book. And it makes me think of, I think it was years ago in Five Leaves Bookshop that I came across a badge that said, read, think, resist. And it was something that had really stuck with me as that thing of, you know, books, when we talk about social movements, can only have so much capacity to affect change. And I'd only really been thinking about them in terms of like, okay, well, then you read something and it changes the way you think, and then you go out into the world and you do something with that. But what's really interesting about your book, and what's really interesting about some of the ways these other books on the shortlist have come about, is that the resisting and the acting began in the very process of writing the book, and you kind of upend those ideas of how we should be writing books, exploring ideas, presenting ourselves as authorities. So thank you for an astonishing work, and thank you to the other contributors. Next up, we have Rhian Jones for Paint Your Town Red. Will you tell us about your book, please?
Hiya. Again, like it's really great to be here, and it's a huge pleasure to be nominated alongside so many other fantastic books and authors. Paint Your Town Red is basically a collection or a snapshot of various ideas and experiments for change that are based around the idea of democratic localism, communitarianism, and collectivism. And these range from, which is probably the most well-known, Preston City Council's experiments in bringing back a kind of municipal socialism. My co-author, Matthew, is the head of Preston City Council, so he's been the driving force behind that, and that's kind of the heart of the book. But beyond that, it's become clear that there's a huge impetus for change in this country, and particularly for what we call in the book solving problems from below without permission from above. It's become fairly clear that a succession of governments in this country have no real desire, no interest in changing the way that things have been run for the past 40 years. And that's particularly clear in things like the rhetoric around levelling up, which identified very real, valid problems, but give very insubstantial solutions, and also doesn't seem to address or have any interest in addressing what the causes of these problems are. They treat poverty and structural inequality as though they're kind of naturally occurring phenomena rather than a result of a deliberate series of political choices. So the book attempts to show how people have already done things that have resulted in levelling up, in improving their own situation, and not simply at a local government level, but beyond that at the level of neighbourhood groups, credit unions, mutual aid groups, community energy schemes, and also at a regional and national level, which is being trialled by the Welsh Government at the moment with things like the Future Generations Act. What I'm going to do, it was hard to find a reading that worked in isolation, so I'm just going to do a reading from the introductory chapter, which is called Getting Out of the Mess We're In. In 2019, a former advisor to the UK Treasury admitted with surprising bluntness that the free market experiment has just about run its course. And after 4 decades, what we can see is that the result is fairly dismal. Low productivity, regional inequalities, and a system that doesn't respond to long-term risks or the need for long-term investment. However refreshingly frank that statement was, it hardly came as news to many of us. The current crisis has been decades in the making and is rooted in the past 40 years of economic strategies which have overseen a rolling back of the welfare state, deindustrialization, a tax on wages and working conditions, restrictions on trade unions, and weakening of local civic infrastructure. All of this has been exacerbated by the austerity imposed in response to the financial crisis of 2008. In 2019, a report commissioned by the UN described the effects of a decade of austerity in the UK as a deliberately imposed and unnecessary social calamity, involving systematic disadvantage inflicted particularly on those least equipped to cope with it. Even before this point, previous responses to deindustrialization and the structural unemployment and impoverishment it wrought on so many communities were counterproductive, as both national governments and local authorities concentrated on creating jobs with no attention to the quality, conditions, or long-term security of this work, and handed public money to corporations who mishandled their plans for regeneration or let them collapse. In the UK, the central government's programme of cuts and hostility to local government is one reason for a widespread loss of faith in local as well as national elected representatives. But another reason is the frequent dominance of local government by those who either use it for personal career advancement or see it as their job to fatalistically manage decline rather than to find alternatives to it. This book then brings together examples of how local economies can be transformed and economic relations realigned at the level of nation, region, city, community, and neighbourhood. It demonstrates how local communities, councils, businesses, and organisations across Britain and beyond are establishing alternative models of public spending, worker ownership, access to housing, and provision of basic services. Besides making immediate material improvements for the communities concerned, this approach is one of taking back control in a way that challenges attempts to assert control and stability through forms of centralised authoritarianism or through concessions to right populisms, racism, and xenophobia. These experiments in democratic localism are not complete, neat, or orderly. How could they be? The present era is one of chaos, crisis, and collapse, and attempts to construct alternatives are accordingly chaotic too. But what this book hopes to demonstrate is the possibility and importance of having a go yourself. We are unlikely to do a worse job of it than those currently in charge.
That was terrific. What a note to end on. I loved the hope, that very tangible, fervent hope that there was in the book. That, as you know, it can't get any worse. We have, at some point, you have to just do. And I think that's such a scary thing for so many of us. Where do you start? How do you do? And I think that roadmap that the two of you provide is both so expansive and so discreet, that, you know, we can all, in whatever it is that we're doing, learn something from it. And I would hope to see every council, the length and breadth of the country, picking it up. But just for the every reader, it was so refreshing and empowering, and I'm so thrilled that it made the shortlist. So thank you, for that. We have unfortunately, we don't have Xiaohong Pai with us tonight. She couldn't make it. But I wanted to just read briefly the blurb for the book, so that her presence and the presence of this brilliant book, which was a real favorite of all the judges as well, from very early on. And she is a previous winner, and we had to choose not to hold that against her, because she has yet again written a fearless and very brilliant and very current book. So just if you'll allow me just a few words from this one, and then we'll open up to questions. So for all of you watching online, this is your time to pop into the chat, whether you're on YouTube or in the website. Stick your questions in there, and then we will invite everyone back on screen to field those. But here is just a brief overview from Ciao Ousmane, The Hidden Exploitation of Italy's Migrant Workers. In 2013, Ousmane Diallo, a 26-year-old Senegalese olive harvester, lost his life when a gas canister exploded in a Sicilian field. As an African migrant, he was little mourned. But though they'd been deliberately forgotten, neither the events of Ousmane's life nor his tragic death are uncommon. Across Italy today, African workers toil in the fields that make it one of Europe's largest exporters of fruit and vegetables. Having fled home countries devastated by colonialism and global capitalism, those who survive the journey across the Mediterranean arrive on European shores only to find themselves systemically segregated and exploited. They have been subject to angry anti-migrant policies over decades from administrations across the political spectrum. Trapped in a chokehold of subhuman living and working conditions, they are the dehumanized other, invisible by design. The people hidden behind foods and goods branded "Made in Italy." Ciao Ousmane is the story of this subordinated class. Through the lives and stories of Italy's migrant workers, Xiaohong Pai exposes the open secret of how state and society create necessary outcasts. This is a bitter, frank, and moving tale of racial capitalism against which workers constantly find new ways to organize and fight back. It is a truly brilliant book. And again, it provides an insight around migration to Europe and across dangerous routes that then show that the danger isn't over once you arrive, that I think there are so many lessons to be learned here. And again, there is that hopeful note of the what next and how we fight back and how people are already doing that. So in her absence, a wee shout out to this brilliant fifth book. We have a few questions online to start us off with. So I'd just like to invite everyone back on screen now so I can put these questions to you all. Thank you so much. So the first one has come from Jenna, who says, the books are very current, but also cover long-lasting issues. How did you pitch to publishers, and did you think they were receptive because of the moment? Who wants to go first? Okay, I'm going to go start at the top and work my way down. So Koshka, you're at top left. I'm going to ask you first. Do you have an answer for that?
Sure. Yeah, that's a really great question. Our book was kind of really interesting in that the moment was changing in the course of the project. So the publisher had already pitched to me back in 2018-19 to put together this collection, and we'd kind of begun work on it. Absolutely, the historical aspect is really, really important to understanding the kind of the harms and the dynamics of policing in racial capitalism, so that was kind of already very present in the we've got fantastic historical chapter in particular by chapters in particular by Connor Woodman and Tanzel, who may be popping in at some point soon. So we kind of already had this sense of a historical an analysis of the police as and policing institutions historically was going to be really crucial. But then what was really extraordinary, I suppose, between 2019 when this project was being initiated by, as I mentioned in my reading at the start, actually by the publisher approaching me to bring it together on the basis of our shared understanding of the harms of policing that we'd developed through meeting in those struggles, then the landscape completely shifted, and it became of the current moment in a way that it wasn't. And what shifted was obviously the kind of most the last few years of Black Lives Matter protests in particular, that kind of global moment. So yeah, great question, and I'm so grateful to be working with a cooperative publisher who was on it, ahead of the game.
Brilliant. Sita, you're next on my screen.
I'm trying to think back because my recollection of it is a bit garbled, but I think Gargi already had a relationship with Pluto, and I think a couple of the other co-authors had also worked with Pluto before, so it seemed like a kind of natural home for the project. And when we approached them, they seemed into the idea, and I think they thought having 8 co-authors for something that wasn't divided up into single author chapters was quite weird, and they sort of thought, all right, fine, if you think you can do that, go for it, was pretty much the kind of response, I think, because it was quite a weird thing to do. But they were super supportive and very patient with the fact that they never knew who was going to reply to an email or respond to something. So that's kind of how we went about it.
Priyan, if I bounce to you next.
Okay. The book was pitched as something very much of the moment, and also hopefully of the next moment as well, because it's as you were saying, it's all about what next. The experiment that Preston was doing had been around since about 2010, and again it was inspired by the failure of previous models, first of all the crash of 2008, and then the impact that had on various external investors and multinational companies who were sort of pulling out of Preston and exacerbating the impact of deindustrialization. And it was that failure of previous orthodoxy that made it a lot easier to say, well, hang on a minute, isn't there something else that we could try, and sort of get the Preston model accepted as something new. But what the book, particularly for me, because I'm a historian, what the book allowed us to do was contextualize all these ideas, because the majority of them are not new. Ideas about mutual aid, cooperation and worker ownership have been around for centuries. Municipal socialism, was first tried in the late 1800s. There was a pamphlet produced by Welsh miners in 1912 called The Miner's Next Step, which was a sort of anarcho-syndicalist pamphlet that presented an alternative to the Labour government's idea of nationalising the mines. And they were saying, well, no, can't we have actual workers' control. So there's all these, I think, really fascinating ideas put forward, again, by ordinary people, by trade unions, for centuries now. And possibly this is a very rosy view of the collapse of late capitalism, but it's the very obviousness of its collapse might mean that some of these ideas are getting a chance now and a space to breathe and to be taken seriously, and to have concrete results in a way that they weren't before. So that was mostly my pitch for the book, and I hope that it's been pulled off.
I think so. And I think Repeater clearly did see, I love that question because it's so true, that sense of these books feeling very immediate. And yet, obviously, they were also published last year and they seem to get more current by the day. You're next up, Florian.
Hi, yes. So I was very lucky in that instant because the famous cartoonist Woodrow Phoenix took my book, or what it was before, to Myriad edition, and Myriad is very good at publishing stories that are not very well known but need very much to get out there. So I didn't do any pitching. I was just very, very lucky, and Myriad loved the story and helped me to get it out there. We worked together over nearly 2 years to get it done or completed.
It's quite a stretch. The next question, I think, so from Sen, ties into that one, which is writing authoritative books like these and having them seen as credible and important is so hard when you're not an academic or specialist. But we need more voices from beyond those ivory towers. Can you talk about creating these books and claiming that space for yourselves? Who wants to go first?
I'll just step in to say a few words. You just need passion. You need to be interested in a subject that you want the people to know about it. You want to talk about it, and to be really, really interested in the subject. And then you do your research. For me, I witnessed some of these because I come from Mauritius and I've seen the people and I've seen the lives. So some of the illustrations are from my own, from what I've seen, what I've witnessed. But this is mainly what you need, passion, I would say. And lots of work. Lots of sleepless nights.
Does anyone else want to speak from beyond the ivory towers? How do we get more of those voices? How did you encourage those?
Yeah, I may as well, because I'm not an academic. And I mean, in my case, I want to be honest and say that connections are important. And I think in those terms, small radical publishers play a hugely valuable role, because I think they do make an attempt to be open to and to seek out new voices. I think even sort of the pitching process, the fact that you can just do it through a website rather than having to go through an agent or something like that, I think is valuable. Yeah, I mean, as someone who sort of, I'm not quite sure what the word is, maybe a para-academic or something, like I'm a lapsed academic. But for me, it's extremely important to, if you do manage to get a platform and a pitch, and you're writing a book like Paint Your Town Red, like it's vital to get ordinary people's voices in there and try and develop to match the way that things like community wealth building is being taken up at local government level, also developing some sort of democratic momentum and some popular momentum to match that, getting ordinary people involved so that communities themselves are in the driving seat rather than having these things sort of done on their behalf or to them. But yeah, I think in general, I think more publishers should be following the lead of small radicals and indies, and making it easier for people outside academia to both write and to pitch.
100% agree. Let's hear it for the small indies and the radicals. Did either of you want to jump in on that one, or are you happy to go to the next question?
I could say something on that, which is a really fantastic and important question. And it made me think of a couple of lines actually from the introduction to Abolishing the Police, which I didn't include earlier, but which I think speak to it. So one is that the book, our book, our collection, was written by many of the people in it do have some kind of academic background or position, but a kind of crucial common feature of all of us is that we've experienced and borne witness to state violence and been part of struggles against it and write out commitment to those struggles. So that was a kind of, when I was thinking about what this collection would look like, I think that was a kind of principle. The reason for that is, as I put it in the introduction, to learn the truth about policing, people would have to listen to the testimonies of those who experienced it. And so part of the purpose of the book is to understand how criminalization functions to exclude from public discourse precisely the voices that have the knowledge about how policing operates, and to kind of unpick the way that this notion of the criminal and these kind of violent processes of criminalization are about excluding knowledge about policing from kind of there's this sort of gulf between the people who experience policing and know what it's like, and then a lot of people who chat shit about policing in like academic circles or policy circles or kind of in the media. And part of what the book is aiming to do is to kind of to bridge that gulf in solidarity with other forms of action that are also bringing the realities of policing to public attention. For example, through confronting police physically, in the streets, in schools, and so on.
Thank you so much for that. Sita, did you have a final comment on there?
Just that we, everyone who was involved in writing Empire's Endgame is an academic of sorts, and we all felt that this was a kind of break from our institutional lives. And so, yeah, we absolutely came with all of the kind of access to academic life that some of that entails. And I'm sure that without that, we would have really struggled to write a book like this one. So it was really very much a kind of result of both some of what academia allows and some of what academia frowns upon that we ended up writing this particular book at this particular time.
Yeah, and I can imagine it made a few waves within Ivory Towers. I think I'm very conscious of time, so I just want to take a moment and to invite all of you who are at home or at work or wherever you are on your phones, on your devices, to dorkily put your hands together for these amazing writers and their extraordinary books, and this Bread and Roses shortlist that we should all be reading and go out and enjoy. So thank you to you all. Thank you very much. I think the time has come to announce our winner. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask everyone to turn off your cameras, and then I will announce our winner, and then you can pop back onto the screen at that point. So on behalf of all of the judges who come from wildly different backgrounds, different ages, different races, different life creeds, it was a virtually impossible task to take from these 5 very different books one winner. How do you measure that? How do you measure the quality? So we had to just decide, because it wasn't going to be measured in that way. We had to decide on a book that we thought met the criteria, and decide on a book that was going to go out into the world and play its part in changing the world, and that might not have that opportunity without this prize. And that book that just sort of stuck with us and kept whispering back. And so the winner of the 2022 Bread and Roses Award for Radical Publishing from Myriad Press is The Chega's Betrayal by Florian Grasset. If you will pop your camera back on and say a few closing words.
Wow, this is amazing, amazing news. I'm so surprised. I was just telling my friends earlier that I never win anything, so I wouldn't be winning, because being among the shortlisted is already winning. And I'm very, very proud of the book, obviously. Thank you so much, the Alliance of Radical Books. Thank you, Lighthouse Bookshop. Thank you, Myriad, for entering Chega's Betrayal in the competition. And I cannot name all the people who've been supportive, but thank you, everyone. I'm more than happy. I'm thrilled, obviously, and very proud of the book and its achievement. But most importantly is for the Chagosians themselves. And this award will shed light on their existence and the fight, their plight, and this will bring their story to light. And so hopefully more people will become aware of what they went through and what they are asking now. So thank you very much. I'm speechless, really, because this is amazing. I'll be bouncing in a minute.
Congratulations. We had one question from the audience that we didn't get to before, and seems a really good note to end on, which was from Darren, who asked, if your book were to inspire any one action from readers, what would you want it to be?
Be political about stuff. I mean, when I mean political, is like take actions, write to your MPs, put it out on social media, make people aware of what has been done in your name and what needs to be done now to make things right.
Brilliant. What a wonderful note to end on. Thank you to all of our shortlistees for being here. For putting your extraordinary work and your labours into the world so that we can help build a better one. Thank you to my fellow members of the Alliance of Radical Booksellers. Do check them out. Shop Radical this Yuletide season. We have an excellent selection of books for you. And so I'm going to cut the live feed now. Please all enjoy the rest of your evening. Read. And thank you very much. And thank you to Ross from Five Leaves and to Nick from Housemans for